Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, I am Ahmed Mumtaz Mustahsan, your teacher for CSC 141 Introduction to Computer Programming. Today we will discuss preprocessor directives. I promised you in the beginning that I will be delivering one exclusive lecture explaining all these preprocessor directives. So I have reserved this lecture, maybe some part of the next lecture as well, in which I will be explaining to you what are these preprocessor directives. Preprocessor directives are programs that process the source code before passing it to the compiler. Okay, and preprocessor commands are called preprocessing or the preprocessor directives. This is considered as a language within a C language. But we have survived without it, and we have been using the C compiler, and we have been spending a lot of time working in the Visual C environment without having the understanding and knowledge of the preprocessor directives. You remember, I used to copy few commands that was one of the command was include IOStream, using namespace, include stdio. These commands I introduced to you as preprocessor directives. But today we will go through it in detail. Quickly, the environment facilities, rather utilities and their functions. We know the purpose of the editor. Whatever algorithm we make, we prepare a handwritten algorithm, we convert it into the source code. And what is source code? Instructions of the C language. Instructions that translate the algorithm into C language basically is the source code. When we build the source code, the step number one, there is a utility which is called a preprocessor. This preprocessor utility picks up the source code that you have produced by using the editor, and the output of the editor is a file, whatever the file name you have given to it, .cpp or .c, confirming that it is the source code. You might remember in one of my example, I have shown you that all the white spaces, including space, tabs, enter key, carriage return key, new line keys, all the blank lines are eliminated by the preprocessor directive, and the whole code becomes a contiguous or continuous sequence of characters. That is one of the job or one of the activity taken up by the preprocessor, and the preprocessor not only carries out this task, but also it translates all the commands, all the directives that you have given to the preprocessor directive, as a directive. It translates all these commands into the instructions and perform the task for you. And the output of the preprocessor directive or preprocessor utility is expanded source code with the extension .i. This is basically the source code with converting and resolving all the commands that you have given to the preprocessor directive. Then remember, we use the compiler command, and the compiler basically takes the output provided by the preprocessor and converts it into the object code. This object code is also called relocatable code. Why it's called relocatable code? Because you can relocate it into the memory of the computer. You can place it in anywhere in the memory of the computer, but you cannot execute it. Why you cannot execute it? Because the address resolution has not been done. The linking process has not been completed. The resolution, the address of the variable names that you have provided are not linked up together. The addresses of the function that you have used in your code is not resolved. So this is done by a utility called a link utility. So all the addresses are resolved and a map is provided by this utility, and your code is saved in the form of executable. This is a code that is self-sufficient. This code that you can run it anywhere. Anywhere means on any compatible machines. So these were the functions performed by the different utilities: card editor, card preprocessor, compiler, and the linker. Now let us concentrate on with the preprocessor. What are the directives and what are the commands of the preprocessor? That is the topic of today. This preprocessor offers several features, several facilities, and these facilities, basically each directive, these facilities provide you different facilitation process or carry out the task on your instructions. So the preprocessor commands are also called as preprocessor directives. So each directive begins with a symbol called this hash symbol. याद है ना आपको? First hash sign space include. So we start all the directive with the hash symbol. This is the first concept. The directive, this command can be placed anywhere in the source code. Anywhere means you can place it in the beginning, you can place it somewhere in the middle, or you can place it at the end of the program. But the common practice is, the most common facilities or the most common preprocessor directives are requested in the beginning of your main program. Let us try to categorize these commands. Define directive, that is used as a macro expansion. What is that? We will discuss it in detail. Include, you already have seen that, but today we will discuss it in detail. Then conditional compilation. Condition compilation is done with the help of if or else if command, or if defined, if not defined, and if. These are all different commands. I have just given one example per category. And miscellaneous command is undefined, or there is another command that I will show you when we will reach to this particular category. Okay, let's start with the first one. Define directive used for macro expansion. What is this macro and what is expansion? I'll just take one example here. Suppose we have defined a variable. It's not variable, this is just something which is called a macro template. I'll give you the name later on. Okay, so I have defined upper, any name that I want to give it, no restrictions here, because before the code is submitted to the compiler, it will be resolved. So I have defined upper equal to 25. Note that no equal sign is here. Okay, so when I use this in the for loop, for I is equal to 1, I is less than equal to upper, this value 25 is replaced with this upper here. Okay, so what is the advantage? I should have used 25 here, but there must be some advantages that we will discuss in few minutes, that why I have defined this upper here. Instead of writing 25 in the loop, we have defined a constant before the start of the definition of main function. As I said, we can define it in the beginning. We can define it anywhere before we want to use it. So in the beginning we have used the command define upper 25. The above statement is called macro definition. This is called macro definition, or more commonly we can call it as macro. So whatever we do with the define directive is basically we are defining our macros. We are defining macros to facilitate us for providing different type of data that we want to pass it on to the compiler. During pre-processing, the processor replaces every occurrence of upper in the program with 25. You might have used a command in Microsoft Word, find and replace. So this directive is basically find and replace. What it does, it find all the occurrence of upper in the main program and replaces it with the value that we have provided, and in this example the value that we have provided is 25. So basically this is find and replace command. I'll give you the justification also, but before that just would like to use another example in which we have defined the value of pi. You know what is the value of pi? It is 22 by 7. And if we resolve 22 by 7 up to 4 decimal places, it is 3.1415. So the value of pi has been defined here, and this area is equal to pi multiplied by r, and value of r is given. So it will replace r with 6.25, and value of area जो है that can be computed by putting the value of pi here, and you can compute the area and you can find out that this is the answer. Okay, so let us see what concept are related to this macro. Upper and pi in the above programs are called macro templates. Okay, macro templates. We have defined upper with the defined directives, then we defined pi with the defined directive. So these two, upper and pi, two names that we have used basically are constants that we have defined with the defined directive, is called macro template. These are called macro template. Whereas the value that I have provided for these macro templates are called macro expansions. So we define macro templates and we assign certain values. The definition of the constants, we can give them any name, are called macro templates, and whatever value that we assign to these macro templates are called macro expansions. दो चीजें, macro template जो आप नाम असाइन करते हैं और जो उसको डेटा असाइन करते हैं उसको कहते हैं macro expansion. When we compile a program, then before handing over the source code to the C compiler, मैंने आपको बताया that this preprocessor converts all the directives into the actual data. So what the C compiler will see? C compiler will see the values. So C compiler को upper और pi नजर नहीं आएगा, बल्कि C compiler को इसकी macro expansions, and what is macro expansion? 25 and 3.1415 will be able to see the data, will be able to see the constant value that is associated with the macro template. So when it sees preprocessor, it goes through the entire program in search of all the macro templates. Whenever it finds it, it replaces it with the macro expansion. आसान होगी ना बात कि क्या करता है preprocessor? Find. What does it find? It finds macro templates and replace. What does it replace? It replaces it with the macro expansion. Okay, I hope आपको ये बात समझ में आ गई है. So when this resolution, this function of the preprocessor is completed, the output is passed on to the C compiler. In C programming, it is customary to use capital letters for macro template. आपने देखा मैंने upper use किया है with the uppercase UPPER, okay. Similarly, pi use किया है with capital P. So एक custom है that whenever we define such macro templates, we use the uppercase, okay. जिस तरीके से we use lowercase, that is also a custom for the variable names. Variable name के भी हम lower case को prefer करते हैं और lower case characters को use करते हैं. इसी तरीके से हम define directive से जो हम instruction pass करते हैं, macro templates define करते हैं, we define it in the upper case. A macro templates and its macro expansion both are separated by blanks. आपने देखा in the previous example here, this is what? This is PI is a macro template and there is a space. There is a space and this is called the macro expansion. So macro template, space, macro expansion. Similarly, the space between hash and define keyword is optional. यानी कि यहाँ पर जो हमने define use किया है word, you can see that this define word here, the space is optional. You can use a space or you may not use a space. This is optional. Okay, let's go back. Important point that you should always remember is that there should not be any semicolon. Semicolon हम कहाँ use करते हैं? We use the semicolon to terminate the statement. एक valid C statement is terminated with a semicolon. This is not a C statement. Okay, ये जो आप directives हैं, these are not the statements of the C language. हम कहते हैं कि the directives are instructions to the compiler. These are the instructions to the compiler. Whereas the statements of the C are basically the statements of the C compiler, statements for the system. जो हम C language की statements होती हैं, those are the statements for the system for their execution. Whereas the preprocessor directives are the instructions to the compiler. Okay? Why we use macros? That could be a very important question. The answers are, number one, it improved the readability, made the easier to read. Although the 3.1415 is a very commonly used constant and most of the people know that it is related with pi. But there are number of other examples where the constant does not make any sense. So while you are going through the source code and you find certain constants, it stops you. It stops you. आप उस जगह पर रुक जाते हैं कि what is that? Why we are using this constant? What is the purpose of this constant? Where we should relate this constant? Okay? So in order to have a good readability, हम उसको एक meaningful name assign कर देते हैं. Okay, and that meaningful name is assigned through macro definitions और जिसको के हम resolve कर देते हैं. Another example could be \n. We have used it many times. Now you must know that \n is used within the double quotes to provide you a new line, a blank line, or to take the cursor to the start of the next line. Instead of using this \n, if we define it with a macro, we can define \n equal to new line, or rather we will define new line and its translation will be \n. So it is more meaningful and should facilitate the reader or facilitate the code, to facilitate the other programmer to understand the code provided by some other programmer. यानी कि किसी A programmer ने कोड लिखा है और उसमें अगर आप ये यूज करेंगे and programmer B is going through the code, तो it will facilitate the programmer B to understand what you have done and where you have done it. The second reason, easier to update many occurrences of a constant. Suppose we have defined upper is for example a loop variable, a loop counter. आपने loop counter एक बनाया for example in the beginning you said that loop counter should be equal to 25. Once you debug your program, once you know that your program is ready to run, now it should run with the actual data, and this time you want that this program should run 10,000, this loop should execute 10,000 times. Now suppose you have defined this loop many times in different locations of your program. Now you are required to find out each and every for loop to update the constant value. 25 को आपने replace करना है 10,000 से. So what you will do? You will replace it in every place where you have used the loop variable as a constant. But if you have defined it with a macro, with a defined directive, you will just make one single change and the occurrence of it in every place of your program will automatically be updated. So this is a convenience. Okay, beyond this change will be made automatically to all occurrence of PI. वही जो मैंने बात अभी आपको explain की कि suppose you want to जो मैंने आपको एक example दी, this is the basically second example that the PI usually we use pi as 3.1415, but sometimes you want a very accurate value of pi, and very accurate value of pi is not 3.1415, it is 3.141592. And suppose if you want to use the more accurate value, what you will do, you will simply change, if you are using the defined directive, you will simply change its value and rest of the occurrences automatically be updated beyond the point where you have defined it. Okay, एक जगह पर आप चेंज करें उसकी वैल्यू और जहां जहां पर आपने वो मैक्रो को यूज किया है सब जगह पर वो ऑटोमेटिकली चेंज है वो रिफ्लेक्ट हो जाएगी. This convenience may not be very useful if you are writing a small program, जो कि मैंने examples आपको show किए, क्योंकि there were only hardly one single utilization of this pi value. But suppose you are writing a long programs where you are using this value, this particular value number of times, then the significance of using this macro will be very fruitful and very useful. You may ask me कि अगर हमने इसको वेरिएबल का नाम ही देना है तो why not use variable? आप ये भी तो कह सकते हैं ना कि मैंने एक वेरिएबल डिफाइन कर दिया, although it was not a variable, it was a macro, लेकिन आप मुझसे कह सकते हैं कि एडिशनल चीज करने की क्या जरूरत पड़ी है जबकि हम इसी किस्म के किसी कांस्टेंट को एक वेरिएबल दे दें एंड यू विल सिंपली चेंज द वैल्यू ऑफ दैट पर्टिकुलर वेरिएबल एट द टाइम ऑफ इट्स इनिशियलाइजेशन एंड रेस्ट ऑफ द प्रोग्राम विल ऑटोमेटिकली बी फैसिलिटेटेड. वही जो जस्टिफिकेशन मैंने मैक्रो के लिए यूज की थी. और ये बात भी कि अ वेरिएबल कुड आल्सो हैव प्रोवाइडेड अ मीनिंगफुल नेम. जिस तरह मैंने पाई यूज किया था तो पाई को एज ए वेरिएबल भी यूज कर सकते थे. तो काउंटर आर्गुमेंट ये है कि मैंने फिर वेरिएबल क्यों नहीं यूज किया और मैंने इसको एज ए मैक्रो क्यों यूज किया. सो अ वेरिएबल, yes, a variable can be used instead of macro templates, but we not recommend it. Why we do not recommend it? There are three reasons that it's a bad idea to use a variable instead of macro templates. And what are these 3 reasons? Number 1, it is inefficient since the compiler can generate faster and more compact code for constant than it can do for variables. आपको याद है मेरे शुरू के लेक्चर में जब मैंने आपको बताया था fetch, decode, execute. सो वेरिएबल का पहले आपको एड्रेस निकालना है, उस पर्टिकुलर एड्रेस पे जाना है, उसके डेटा को पिक करना है, उसको फेच करना है. जबकि टेम्पलेट्स के केस में इट इज वेरी फास्ट. क्यों? क्योंकि एट द टाइम वेयर यू वांट टू यूज इट, कंपाइलर में जहां जहां पर उस वेरिएबल की वैल्यू यूज करनी है वहां पर ऑटोमेटिकली डेटा इज प्रोवाइडेड. So you are not supposed to go and access to the memory location and pick up the data and bring it into that particular instructions, because directly the data is available as an operand. एक डायरेक्ट डेटा की वैल्यू जो है वो आपके पास अवेलेबल है. That is much faster as compared to using the variable. So we can say that it is inefficient since the compiler can generate faster and more efficient code for the macros instead of variables. Second argument could be using a variable for what is really a constant encourages sloppy thinking. क्या मतलब इसका? कि भाई जो एक कांस्टेंट है उसको कांस्टेंट ही रहने दें. जब किसी कांस्टेंट को एक वेरिएबल नेम असाइन कर दे तो वेरिएबल का मतलब है कि इट शुड वेरी बट द डेटा इज कांस्टेंट. सो एक कांस्टेंट के लिए वेरिएबल को यूज करना इज रियली अ स्लॉपी थिंकिंग. सो वी डिस्करेज टू यूज अ वेरिएबल फॉर द डेटा विच इज बेसिकली अ कांस्टेंट डेटा. थर्ड लॉजिक क्या हो सकती है सपोर्ट में यूजिंग टेम्पलेट इंस्टेड ऑफ वेरिएबल, एंड दैट इज देयर इज ऑलवेज अ डेंजर दैट अ वेरिएबल में एडवर्टेंटली गेट ऑल्टर्ड. अनइंटेंशनली आप वेरिएबल की वैल्यू को चेंज कर सकते हैं, मिस्टेकनली उसकी वैल्यू को चेंज कर सकते हैं, अनडिजायरेबली आप उस वेरिएबल की वैल्यू को चेंज कर सकते हैं. जबकि अगर आपने उसको इफ यू आर यूजिंग इट एज ए कांस्टेंट यू विल नेवर एवर चेंज इट. सो दीज आर बेसिकली द 3 गुड रीजंस दैट एनकरेज अस टू यूज मैक्रोज, टू यूज मैक्रो टेम्पलेट्स इंस्टेड ऑफ यूजिंग द वेरिएबल्स. So let's take the examples of the macro templates. It's not just the constant that we can define with the help of defined templates or the templates, so macro templates. So we can do something very interesting. In this particular example, we have defined directive for operators. Sorry. Here we use this double and किसके लिए? डेट रिप्रेजेंट एंड. तो अगर ये एंड रिप्रेजेंट कर रहा है एंड को तो व्हाई डोंट वी डिफाइन इट टू improve the readability? If we define and, which will be translated as it is, so here we can say if f is less than 5 and this we can do that. Similarly we can define or, we can use this and or. Here x is less than equal to 20 or y is less than equal to 45. So we have defined the conditional operators and or, okay, conditional operators with the help of this macro templates, and we can use it. So खाली constants ही use नहीं कर सकते बल्कि हम वेरिएबल जो ऑपरेटर्स हैं उनको भी हम टेम्पलेट्स के तौर पर डिफाइन कर सकते हैं फॉर ओवर ओन कन्वीनियंस. What else? Nested macro templates. आपने एक टेम्पलेट को डिफाइन किया, then you can use it. So here we have done 2 very interesting utilization of these macros. First is very simple, जो मैंने पिछले एग्जाम्पल में भी आपको दिखाया कि it has defined and like this, and second define average. Now we can say that if a student gets a marks A is greater than 25 और A is less than 50, किसी बच्चे के नंबर अगर 25 से ज़्यादा और 50 तो we can consider कि that student, वो जो बच्चा है, is an average student और एक average बच्चा है. Okay, so this test A is greater than equal to 25 or and A is less than equal to 50, we have defined it as word average. अब यहाँ पर हमने सिर्फ चेक किया if average, अब हमें A की वैल्यू दी हुई है यहाँ पर, A is 30 and we say that if average then within the range else out of range. अगर तो इस range से बाहर है then it's not average, or if it is within this range, so this way. So this test, instead of writing A is greater than 25 and A is less than 50, we have used average here. And why it is called nested? Because हमने यहाँ पे and define किया था और macro के अंदर हमने इस macro को use कर रहे हैं. This is called nested macro. So in this particular example we have done two things. एक तो we have demonstrated the use of nested macro, and second what we have done, we have used a complete test. If condition के अंदर का जो complete test है, we have defined it as a macro and we can directly use it in our program as we have demonstrated it here. Next, there is another very interesting use of the macro in this particular example. We are passing the arguments just like we pass the arguments in a function. In this particular example, we have defined is digit. अब ये is digit is a very interesting function. We are passing this y as an argument to this macro, and then we open up this macro, expansion of this macro. The template के अंदर we have defined y, and now we are using y, expanding it here. You just try, आप argument किसी function को y as an argument pass on करें और function उस y की value को utilize करे as an argument. Okay? हम एक actual argument pass on करते हैं जिसको formal argument के तौर पे receive करता है. Similarly, we can pass on an argument in a macro that can be expanded with the macro expansion. And here we can say if y is greater than equal to 48 and y is less than equal to 57, it's mean that it is a valid digit. Dear students, this is another topic that I had already promised to teach you, and I still would like to keep my promise कि ये क्या चीज़ है. Basically this is an ASCII value. ASCII value of 0 जो है is 48 in decimal, and 30h in hexadecimal, and 57 in decimal, और hexadecimal में it is 39h. हेक्साडेसिमल में 9 का कोड है 39h, 0 का कोड है 30h. सो आई स्टिल कीप माई प्रॉमिस कि इंशाल्लाह मैं आपको ये ASCII टेबल पूरा बताऊंगा कि हाउ कैन यू जनरेट योर ओन ASCII टेबल. बट इन दिस पर्टिकुलर एग्जाम्पल व्हाट यू कैन डू, यू कैन जस्ट रीड एनी कैरेक्टर फ्रॉम द कीबोर्ड, pass it on to this macro, and this macro should validate whether it is a valid digit or not. जो भी आप करेक्टर कीबोर्ड पे टाइप करेंगे, if you press any valid character between 0 to 9, any valid digit between 0 to 9, it will say you have entered a digit. But if you press anything else, then it will say that you entered an invalid digit. So range क्या है कि आप चेक करते हैं कि जो डिजिट आपने दी है उसका कोड between 0 to 9 है कि नहीं. This is also one way to test that. आप इसकी जगह पर ये भी लिख सकते थे, ओके, क्योंकि इसका दिस इज सेम. 48 इज जस्ट लाइक यू हैव गिवन दिस करेक्टर 0, डिजिट 0. सो आप इसकी जगह पर यूज कर सकते हैं y इज ग्रेटर देन इक्वल टू दिस डिजिट 0 एंड y इज लेस देन इक्वल टू 57 की जगह पर आप ये यूज कर सकते हैं. ओके, सो इंशाल्लाह आई विल टीच यू इन some other lecture, but here the purpose is not this ASCII table, the purpose is the macro, and we have demonstrated a use of macro where we have passed on an argument y to our macro which has been expanded in this macro expansion. Okay, and we have simply used it here इस डिजिट, और हमने यहाँ पे क्या पास किया, ये करेक्टर हमने पास ऑन किया, और ये करेक्टर जनाब रिसीव होगा कहाँ पर, ये इस y को रिसीव हो जाएगा, और फिर ये आ जाएगा एज इफ यू हैव रिटर्न इफ character is greater than equal to 48 and character is less than equal to 57, or if character is greater than equal to 0 or character is less than equal to 9, then you say that you have entered a valid digit इस range के अंदर. Okay, so very powerful use of the macro, where we have passed on certain arguments to the macro. और वो कैसे हमने pass on किए, क्योंकि we have defined a macro with some arguments which we have expanded it in the macro expansion. This is very powerful feature of the macro. Another well-known example जो हमने इससे पहले use किया था, this is the area of a circle. Yes, pi r square. Here I've just used the value 3.14 instead of the 4-digit accuracy, just 2-digit tak. Okay, so 3.14 is a pi multiplied by x multiplied by x. So we have defined a macro template here. This is the definition of the macro template, and this is basically the expansion of this macro template. Okay, and here we have defined here floating r1 is equal to 6.25, r2 is equal to this one, then we said area A is equal to area r1. So this r1 means the value of r1 6.25 will be passed on to this one as an x, and it will be automatically expanded as 3.14 multiplied by 6.25 multiplied by 6.25, and you will get the answer. Then you pass on again, you can pass it on r2 also. The same thing will be. What will happen basically, this macro template will be expanded here. ये मैं भी आपको अगली एग्जांपल में दिखाऊंगा कि सिस्टम के लिए तो ये कॉल नहीं है, जस्ट लाइक फंक्शन की तरह कॉल नहीं हो रहा, बल्कि the preprocessor directive will translate it, and that I just would like to show you here. When the preprocessor pass the code to the compiler, it will automatically, it should have automatically resolved this issue. It should have automatically expanded the macro template को expand करके macro expansion कर चुका होगा, और what the compiler will see, compiler will simply see this statement A is equal to 3.14 R1 and R2, and then for area 2 the compiler will say this. So compiler will never see area of x, rather the compiler will only see these two statements, जिन statements को the compiler should translate or compile and find out the syntax errors and produce the object code. So area of x replaces with 3 point this one, and area of x next time is replaced with this one. Okay, points to remember. While you are defining a macro, there are couple of points that you should always remember. While writing macros with arguments, number one, be careful not to leave a blank between the macro template and its argument. अगर आप इस definition में देखें, here we have defined area, bracket start x, bracket close, and this is the macro expansion. So this is correct. What's wrong in the second statement? In the second statement, we have left a blank here. So area will be translated, and this one here, this is a complete sequence of character which will be expanded to this one. Okay, it will be expanded to this one. But when you leave it this one, what will happen? It will be as if you have defined the area, and this area should be expanded to x here. Okay. Number 2, second point जो आपने याद रखना है, enclose in parentheses. The entire macro expansion should be enclosed within the parentheses. वो क्यों? Because you don't know where it's going to be expanded. अब in this particular example, we have defined square of n is equal to n multiplied by n. नॉर्मल केसेस में इट शुड वर्क, बट इफ वी यूज इट इन द अरिथमेटिक एक्सप्रेशन, इस एक्सप्रेशन के अंदर हाउ इट विल ट्रांसलेट, स्क्वायर ऑफ 4, इट शुड बी 4 मल्टीप्लाई बाय 4. So basically it will be translated like this: j is equal to 64 divided by 4 multiplied by 4. Now the precedence rule says that whichever operators comes first from left to right will be executed. So it will divide 64 by 4 is 16, multiplied by 4, the answer is 64. Whereas the square of 4, the square of 4 should be 16, and 64 divided by 16 means the answer should be 4. The actual answer that you expect is 4, but since you have not enclosed it in the parenthesis, therefore it has broken up here. The system will break it up like this, here and here, so you will get the wrong answer. So the point to remember is the entire macro expansion should be enclosed within the parenthesis. So dear students, we have seen that these macros are like functions. In the previous example, a macro was used to calculate the area of a circle. We could have simply defined a function, and we could have simply passed on the data to the function. And as we know that the function should be able to return back the calculated area. And this macro call is although like the function, but it is not really like the function. आपको मैंने बताया कि ये expand होती है और ये function की तरह control transfer नहीं होता. In macro call, the preprocessor replaces the macro template with macro expansion. Okay, तो it just illusion है. आपको ऐसे लग रहा है कि वो macro जो है वो call हो रही है like a function, but it's not like that. Whereas in the function call, the control is passed, in a function call, the control is passed to a function along with these certain arguments. क्या होता है when we call a function? At the point of the calling the function, जिसको हम function call कहते हैं, the address of the next statement is saved somewhere in a structure, and the control means जब हम address save करते हैं तो उस particular जगह पर execution stop हो जाती है, and control is transferred to the calling function, और calling function execute होता है. When you execute the return statement, once again the execution is stopped, and the address जो आप एक structure में save करके आए थे reload होता है, and control goes back. And this is really a time consuming, and I have already given you the demonstration. एक आपको मैंने पिछले लेक्चर के अंदर बड़ी डिटेल से I have explained कि how this control is transferred from the main program or from a function to a calling function. So let us compare macro versus function. Macro की मदद से प्रोग्राम फास्ट चलता है. We can say that macro make the program run faster but increase the program size. प्रोग्राम साइज क्यों इंक्रीज होता है? वो कट पेस्ट होता चला जाता है और आपके प्रोग्राम का साइज बढ़ जाता है. फंक्शन मेक्स द प्रोग्राम स्मॉलर एंड कॉम्पैक्ट, क्योंकि फंक्शन प्रैक्टिकली पेस्ट नहीं करता इंस्ट्रक्शंस को आपके प्रोग्राम के अंदर. कंट्रोल ट्रांसफर हो जाता है उस फंक्शन पे, एग्जीक्यूट करता है, कंट्रोल वापस आ जाता है. मैक्रो क्या करता है कि वो पूरी की पूरी फंक्शन की जो इंस्ट्रक्शंस हैं, जो मैक्रो की इंस्ट्रक्शंस हैं, मैक्रो टेम्पलेट को एक्सपेंशन कर देता है और फिजिकली इंस्ट्रक्शन को वहां पर पेस्ट कर देता है. सेकंड, इफ यू यूज अ मैक्रो 100 टाइम्स इन ए प्रोग्राम, द मैक्रो एक्सपेंशन goes into our source code at 100 different places. जितनी दफ़ा आप उसको 100 टाइम्स कॉल करेंगे, वो 100 टाइम उसको जहाँ पर आपने कॉल किया है वहाँ पे 100 टाइम कोड को पेस्ट कर देगा. लिहाजा आपका प्रोग्राम का साइज जो है बहुत ज़्यादा बड़ा हो जाएगा. जबकि फंक्शन में क्या होता है? इफ़ अ फंक्शन इज यूज्ड देन इवन इफ इट इज कॉल्ड फ्रॉम 100 डिफरेंट प्लेसेस इन द प्रोग्राम, इट वुड टेक द सेम अमाउंट ऑफ स्पेस, क्योंकि वो कंट्रोल ट्रांसफर होता है, कॉपी नहीं होता. लिहाजा 100 टाइम्स भी आप फंक्शन को कॉल करेंगे, उसका साइज वो ही रहेगा आपके प्रोग्राम का. मैक्रो में क्या है, पासिंग आर्गुमेंट इज नलिफाइड when with macros since they have already been expanded and placed in the source code. वो जो illusion में आपको बता रहा हूँ ना arguments के pass on होने की, वो तो compiler तक पहुँचती नहीं है क्योंकि all the translation is done before that. प्री प्रोसेसर वो ट्रांसलेशन कर देता है, फिजिकली उसको एक्सपेंड कर देता है, देयरफॉर आपकी वो जो आर्गुमेंट्स की पासिंग है वो नहीं होती. वेयर एज द पासिंग आर्गुमेंट टू अ फंक्शन एंड गेटिंग बैक द रिटर्न वैल्यू does take time, okay, and would therefore slow down the program. Okay, so these are the comparison. So what do we achieve? हमने इसको comparison से what we have learned, what we have achieved. If the macro is simple, like in our examples, जो मैंने आपको 2-3 एग्जाम्पल्स दी हैं, इट मेक्स नाइस शॉर्ट हैंड एंड अवॉइड्स द ओवरहेड एसोसिएटेड विद द फंक्शन कॉल्स. Okay, on the other hand, if we have a fairly large macro and it is used most often, then we ought to replace it with the function. समझ में आया कि अगर तो सिंपल है और आपने चंद जगह पर यूज़ करनी है तब तो आप मैक्रो को यूज़ कर सकते हैं. प्रोग्राम का साइज बड़ा होगा बट इट शुड बी मैनेजेबल. बट इफ़ यू आर यूजिंग इट मोर फ्रिक्वेंटली इन मैनी प्लेसेस, देन इंस्टेड ऑफ यूजिंग द मैक्रो you should use the function, and this is the conclusion. Okay, we have completed the first category of the preprocessor directives, and that was the defined directives. The next preprocessor directive is the include, and this directive we have already used it. कहाँ यूज़ किया हमने? हर प्रोग्राम में पहली स्टेटमेंट ही हमारी हैश इंक्लूड विद इन एंगल ब्रैकेट्स क्या था? आईओ स्ट्रीम. ओके, आज देखते हैं कि ये चीज़ क्या है. The second preprocessor directive is for a file inclusion. The directive causes one file to be included in another. The preprocessor command for file inclusion is include this command. Okay, so you are writing a file, means जब आप एक source को टाइप कर रहे होते हैं, you are creating a file. In that particular file, you call another file. The complete code from second file comes and inserted into that particular location where you have used this particular directive or this particular command. The entire contents of the file name to be inserted to the source code at the point where you have requested it. जहाँ पर आपने ये include statement कमांड यूज की है उस जगह पर जिस जगह पे आपने प्रोग्राम में यूज की है और जो फाइल आपने इंक्लूड की है वो इंक्लूड फाइल वहां पे जाकर फिजिकली उस फाइल को जाके पेस्ट कर देगा. वहां पर उसके कंटेंट फिजिकली वहां पर पेस्ट हो जाएंगे. ऑफ कोर्स इट परमिट्स दैट द फाइल टू बी इंक्लूडेड, इट प्रिज्यूम्स दैट, ये अज्यूम ये करता है कि वो जो फाइल आप इंक्लूड करने जा रहे हैं शुड एग्जिस्ट, फाइल आपकी वहां पर होनी चाहिए. हम इसके ऊपर फर्दर भी बात करेंगे इन द नेक्स्ट स्लाइड. व्हेन, बाय एंड वेयर टू यूज, क्यों यूज करते हैं, कब यूज करते हैं, कहां यूज करते हैं, these are the questions we need to answer. So if we have a very large program, the code is best divided into several different small segments. छोटे छोटे मॉड्यूल्स के अंदर आप उसको ब्रेक कर सकते हैं, each containing a set of related function. It is a good programming practice to keep different sections of a large program separate. These files are included at the beginning of the main program. आप include directive से उसको इकट्ठा करें. एक बहुत बड़े प्रोजेक्ट को, एक बहुत बड़े प्रोग्राम को आप ब्रेक कर सकते हैं छोटे छोटे फंक्शंस के अंदर, छोटे छोटे प्रोग्राम्स के अंदर, और उनको आप फिर बाद में एक जगह पर इंक्लूड करके कंबाइन कर सकते हैं टू अ सिंगल एंटिटी, टू अ सिंगल यूनिट. There are some functions and some macro definitions that we need almost in all programs. We need, for example, printf function, scanf function, We need it in almost our program. Or if we are using C in and C out, then we need it. We have to read in the data from the keyboard, and we have to display the result on the screen. So instead of writing the definitions, complete definitions of these functions, we can include it in our program by using the include directive. And you know that we do these type of the facilities that are available. We do use the facilities provided through these preprocessor directives. Okay, these commonly needed functions and macro definition can be stored in a file, and that file can be included anywhere we write this include directive command. Okay, अब ये फाइल है कौन सी? Usually we call it as a header file with an extension .h, iostream.h or stdio.h, conio.h, console.io.h. So .h extension stands for header file. Possibly we call it as header file because it contains the statement which go to the head of our program. हम उसको यूज़ करने से पहले उसको डिफाइन करते हैं, हम डिक्लेयर करते हैं, प्रोटोटाइप करते हैं. तो ये सारी की सारी चीज़ें आर रिक्वायर्ड एट द बिगिनिंग. सो दैट्स व्हाई वी मेक ऑफ इट एज द हेडर फाइल. The prototypes of all the library functions are grouped into a different categories and then stored in different header files. मैंने आपको बताया था कि फंक्शन जो हम डिफाइन करते हैं हमें उसका प्रोटोटाइप देना होता है. सिमिलरली जो सिस्टम अपने फंक्शन यूज करता है, द सिस्टम इज ऑल्सो बाउंड टू प्रोवाइड the prototype of that function. जो restrictions, जो rules and regulation user defined function के लिए हैं, the same rules and regulations are for the system defined function. ऐसा नहीं है कि हमारे लिए rules कुछ और हैं और system के लिए rules कुछ और हैं. No. The same rules are followed by the system. So अगर system जो है compiler के साथ आपके पास जो different functions आ रहे हैं उसकी भी prototype declaration भी चाहिए और उसकी definition भी चाहिए. This declaration and definition is provided in the form of files which are included with the help of preprocessor directives. For example, हमने math के functions पढ़े थे, उसके लिए we are required to include math.h the header file to provide all the prototypes. Similarly, मैंने आपको console.io बताया था, stdio बताया था. We need to provide this definition, and for that purpose we include conio.h or the math function के लिए math.h. How can we include files? Mostly we have included the file iostream.h with the help of this second option. Okay, with the help of this second option, include file name. Actually there are two ways, number one, number two. We can use this angle bracket or even we can use this double quote, but both have got different meanings. Let us see कि इसकी meaning क्या है, double quote की क्या meaning है और angle bracket की क्या meaning है. When we include a file, for example, goto.c command would look for the file goto.c in your current directory. जो आपकी default directory है, जिस directory में आप काम कर रहे हैं. So when you put the header file under double quotes, then the system look for the file, search करता है उस file को to your default directory, which is your current directory, or the directory that you have defined it in the environment. But when you use, if suppose you use include with angle bracket command, it would look for the file in the specified list of directories only. अब specified list of directories क्या है? Whatever environment we are using, we can define what is our default directory, what is our current directory, where should the system find the header files, which file should contain all the header file library, आपकी जो IO stream है वो कहाँ से है, stdio कहाँ पर है, you can educate the environment. वो जो environment है उसमें आप बता सकते हैं, path define कर सकते हैं कि header file जो है वो कहाँ पर मिलेगी. And once again I promise you that next time we'll be using this, demonstrating this Visual C environment. I will show you how can you define or you set up the path for your header files. Okay, I'll give you a practical demonstration inshallah. Next preprocessor directives is conditional compilation. You can compile the code conditionally, means you can skip some code or you can compile some other part of the code. If required, we can direct the compiler to skip over one section of the source code and just compile the other section of the source code. That we can do with the help of certain commands. और ये commands यहाँ पर कौन कौन सी हैं? If defined and if. So if defined and end if, which have the general format like this: if defined macro name, then do this, and if. So what will happen? If macro name has been defined, the block of code will be processed as usual, otherwise it will not. अगर ये macro name is defined, then and only then this part of code will be compiled और आपको इसका executable मिलेगा. But if this macro name is not defined, then this code is not going to be compiled. और आपके पास executable में, object code में ये code नहीं होगा तो obviously executable में भी नहीं होगा. कहाँ use करेंगे इसे? Where would this if defined be useful? There are different cases. Okay, rather there are three cases जो मैं आपको बताऊंगा कि इसके फ़वाइद जो हैं वो तीन मुख्तलिफ तरीकों से हम उठा सकते हैं. When would you like to compile only a part of your program? कब कब हमें इसकी ज़रूरत पेश आ सकती है? Case number 1. To comment out the obsolete lines of code. Suppose you have completed a code in the last minutes, आपने उसको डिलीवरी देनी है और last minutes के अंदर आपको यूज़र ने कहा कि नहीं इसमें से ये टेस्ट नहीं चाहिए मुझे, I don't want to have this type of test, आप इस टेस्ट को निकाल दें. What you will do? Either you will delete that code, but जो experienced programmers हैं, veteran programmers हैं, पुराने लोग हैं, they never delete that. अब वो क्या करते हैं? They have two options. Either वो उसको commit कर सकते हैं or they use this if defined. Why? उन्हें पता है कि that particular client will come back again and say no, please put back the same code. वो जो चेक हमने आपसे निकलवाया था उस चेक को उसके अंदर डाल दीजिए. अब आपका एंड यूज़र, आपका क्लाइंट आपको कहता है कि जो आपने पहले चेक इसमें दिया हुआ था, जो हमारे कहने पे आपने निकाल दिया था, नाउ वी नीड दैट सेम चेक शुड बी प्लेस्ड इन द कोड. व्हाट द प्रोग्रामर विल डू? रिकोड दैट, दोबारा टाइपिंग करे, दोबारा वो कोड को एंटर करे, दोबारा उसकी डिबगिंग करे, दोबारा उसकी टेस्टिंग करे? नो. If the programmer has intelligently handled the situation and has kept it with the if defined with some header and has used it, then it can always include it by simply removing that particular check. So that is the one good use of using the conditional directives, conditional compile directive. And this is the example of that जो मैं अभी आपको explain कर रहा हूँ. You define okay, then this code will, but if say not okay, then you don't define it, then you don't use it. But if you define it, then you can use it. This could be the old code that you can either comment it or you can just use the particular facility that is provided by the C compiler. Okay. Case number 2. Suppose You are working in an environment where you have got multiple platforms. आपके पास कंप्यूटर है, आपके पास इंटेल प्लेटफॉर्म भी है और आपके पास मेट्रोला पीसी भी है. There are certain instructions which we use it with the Intel PC, or there are certain instructions which we use it in the Motorola PC. So what you can do, you can use this facility here, that if you are running your code on the Intel, you can define Intel. If Intel is defined, then this code will be executed, else you will execute the code to the Motorola. So you can see that not if defined, but also we are using the other facilities, which is else, if defined, else, and if. And you can write down one single code for both the computers which are installed in the organization. Just you need to, at the time of putting that code to that particular computer, you just need to define on the Intel computer, you will define Intel. And on Motorola PC, you may not define Intel. If you will not define it Intel, by default it will prepare a code that will be executed on the Motorola machines, or vice versa. This you can do that with the help of this wonderful facility, and that facility is if defined, if, and if, else. ये तमाम फीचर्स जो है हमारे पास मौजूद हैं फॉर प्रोवाइडिंग, क्या हम करने जा रहे हैं, फॉर कंडीशनल कंपाइलेशन, फॉर पुटिंग द कंडीशनल सेट ऑफ सोर्स कोड इन ओवर ऑब्जेक्ट कोड और इन ओवर एक्सिक्यूटेबल. क्योंकि जब ऑब्जेक्ट कोड में डालेंगे तो एग्जीक्यूटेबल में आएगा, अगर ऑब्जेक्ट कोड में कोड नहीं होगा तो वो एग्जीक्यूटेबल में भी नहीं होगा. ओके, सो when you compile the above program, it will compile only the part which you have defined for one particular platform. और इस एग्जाम्पल में मैंने कहा कि अगर आपने Intel को डिफाइन किया हुआ है तब तो this is because the macro Intel has not been defined, but if you don't define this Intel, then the code will not be executed and you can use all the combination. तमाम लॉजिक जो मैंने आपको if control और if structure के साथ पढ़ाई थी, everything is valid here and you can use it as per your convenience. We may use if not defined instead of if defined. ये एक additional macro है, if not defined. जिस तरह ना if A is greater than B, आप चेक कर सकते हैं if A is not greater than B. आप चेक कर सकते हैं if A means A is true. आप ये भी चेक कर सकते हैं if not A. So since this is a feature that is available, so इस directives के अंदर भी ये feature available है. Sometime instead of if defined, if not defined directive is used. आप उसको reverse vice versa आप उसको use कर सकते हैं. For that purpose this facility has been provided. Okay, case number 3. Suppose a function my function is defined in a file myfile.h. आपने ये function define किया, which is included in the file myfile1.h. इसके जरिए आपने इसको include कर दिया. Now in your program file, if you include both myfile.h and myfile1.h, what will happen? There will be a duplication of function. और जब आप उसको कंपाइल करेंगे तो कंपाइलर will flash an error message, multiple declaration of my function.c. So that is a problem. What could be the solution? The best solution is that if you put a code, one single code, that if my function myfile_h means if it is defined, if not defined, then define it. Very simple. If it is not defined, then define it. But if it has already been defined, अब अगर किसी भी ऑर्डर में अगर आपने फंक्शन 1 को पहले इंक्लूड कर दिया है या फंक्शन 2 को किया, I think I have got the example in the next. Yes. First time the file, my file gets included, the preprocessor checks whether a macro code has been defined, myfile_h has been defined or not. If it has not been defined, then it gets defined. Okay, it will be defined क्योंकि आपने चेक लगाया हुआ है. If not defined, then define it. ठीक है. और Next time when you attempt to include the same file, so if it is already defined, then it will not include the file. So आपकी फाइल का जो inclusion है उसके लिए you have got these commands and you can use these commands to include a file or not include a file. So आपका जो एक problem है कि अगर file has accidentally been included twice, so that you can avoid. I think this is sufficient for today. We have gone through almost 80% commands or features that are provided with the preprocessor directives. So the remaining feature, I think I will discuss it in the beginning of the next lecture. Okay? And I strongly suggest you, advise you to go through it. मैं यहाँ पर break इसलिए कर रहा हूँ कि you may not have lot of things to go through. Okay? So that you can go through the information or the concepts that have passed on in this particular lecture, and the remaining 20% or the remaining part of this preprocessor directive I have decided to shift it to the next lecture. Okay dear students, इंशाल्लाह फिर मिलेंगे नए चैप्टर और नए लेक्चर के साथ. Till then, खुदा हाफिज़.